My name is Meridian Hale, and at 71, I've learned the art of letting people believe what they want to. I speak softly, move slowly, and never correct anyone who assumes slowness means confusion. It keeps rooms calm, and sometimes it keeps them honest. That evening, I arrived at my son Kenton's house for his 10th wedding anniversary. The March Hale residence glowed like a magazine spread, crystal light fixtures, imported linens the scent of truffle oil, already thick in the air. Rhea. My daughter-in-law was in her element commanding servers, with one manicured finger, laughing too brightly for anyone's comfort. Meridian, she sang as I stepped inside. You made it. We were just joking you'd probably forget what night it was. Laughter drifted from the dining room. Kenton gave a polite smile, the kind that hides discomfort without taking sides. I set down the small bouquet I'd brought and straightened my shawl. I remember more than you think, I said lightly. Rhea blinked, then patted my arm as if I were a dear old pet who'd tried its best. Dinner passed in waves of conversation about investments, new property in Cape Ann, and a cousin's cryptocurrency success. I chewed quietly, listening, tracing the rim of my glass with one finger. The wine was a young Merlot, showy but hollow, like so much of this house. When dessert came, Rhea stood to give a toast. She tapped her spoon against the glass, waiting for silence. To family, she began flashing that radiant smile. To new beginnings, good fortune, and to the incredible example of perseverance, Meridian Hale, who's somehow still managing to handle life all on her own after retirement. The room burst into laughter. Even Kenton chuckled before catching himself. Someone murmured, "She's a legend," and another whispered, "Bless her heart." My cheeks burned, but not from shame. I lifted my glass, nodded, and smiled back. To family, I said simply. My voice didn't shake. Rhea's gaze lingered, searching for hurt that wasn't there. The chatter resumed loud and careless, as if humiliation were just another course on the menu. I let it all wash over me, the laughter, the noise, the faint echo of knives against porcelain. Inside, a quiet click marked the moment something settled into place. At exactly 8:42 p.m., I memorized every word Rhea had said, every face that had smiled at her joke. Numbers have always been my way of keeping truth steady when emotions threaten to distort it. When the night finally ended, I slipped on my coat, kissed Kenton's cheek, and told him the dinner was lovely. Rhea hugged me perfunctorily, her perfume sweet and sharp. Outside, the autumn air was cold enough to sting. I walked to my car without hurry, the laughter still ringing faintly through the open windows behind me. By the time I reached my townhouse in Cambridge, the clock read 9:18. I set my purse on the table and stared at the locked drawer in my study, the one I hadn't opened in more than 30 years. That was about to change. The house greeted me in its usual hush. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the mantel clock, familiar sounds that marked time more faithfully than people ever did. I hung my coat, turned on the small lamp by the stairs, and let its amber light fill the edges of the room. My townhouse sat 2 blocks from the Charles River, a narrow 3-story brick home lined with books that smelled of age and ink. I bought it with my own savings long before Julian died, before Kenton married Rhea, before quiet became my most trusted companion. The neighbors called it cozy. I called it honest. In the study, dust motes drifted through a stripe of streetlight slicing the room in half. My desk waited, as it always had, stacked with unpaid bills, a cup of pens, and a leather folio, whose corners had softened from decades of use. Against the far wall hung my framed degree, its edges yellowing, M. Ellery, Boston, University Forensic Accounting. Most people assumed Meridian Hale was a retired secretary, maybe a teacher once upon a time. No one ever asked about Missy Ellery, and I never volunteered the connection. A woman learns when to keep her history quiet. I sat the chair creaking like an old friend and slid open the drawer I'd avoided for 3 decades. The brass handle was cool beneath my fingers. The lock still caught at the same place, and I had to tug twice before it gave. Inside lay a life I had folded away. Professional certificates stamped by the Massachusetts Board of Accountancy letters of appreciation from law firms and copies of case files written in my crisp handwriting. The top folder bore a name I hadn't thought about in years, the Everman Trust Fraud, 1989, a case that had once made headlines and nearly destroyed a family business. I had testified in that trial, my analysis the final nail that sent a man to prison. Afterward, I resigned. Julian had said, "Enough battles, Mary. Let peace find you." I traced my name across the old documents. The ink slightly raised my hand, trembling ever so slightly. Age had thinned the steadiness, but adrenaline sharpened the rest. The same current I used to feel when uncovering the truth pulsed again under my skin. For a long while, I sat still, letting memory and present fold into one another. I remembered late nights spent in fluorescent-lit offices poring over ledgers until numbers told their secrets. I remembered the quiet satisfaction of solving what others couldn't see. And I remembered the moment I walked away, believing I could trade skill for serenity. On the shelf above the desk, a small photograph of Julian watched me. His eyes always carried a hint of mischief, even when his health was failing. "You always did like puzzles," he'd say whenever he caught me reorganizing the household accounts. He had trusted me to manage everything when he was gone, but he hadn't known how far that trust would need to stretch. The tremor in my hand eased as I stacked the folders neatly and pulled one fresh notebook toward me. Its first page was blank, but that wouldn't last long. I wrote the date at the top in clean, deliberate strokes, October 14th. Then below it, 3 words that steadied me more than any drink or prayer. Keep everything documented. I closed the drawer gently, the lock sliding into place with a soft click. Upstairs, the radiator hissed to life, and the scent of old paper settled around me. The stillness of the room no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like preparation. 2 days after that dinner, the bell rang just after breakfast. The scent of toast and black coffee still hung in the kitchen when I opened the door to find Rhea standing there, Kenton, behind her holding a bouquet of sunflowers, too bright for a gray morning. "Surprise visit?" Rhea chirped, stepping in before I'd spoken. "We were in the neighborhood." Kenton kissed my cheek. "Hey, Mom." "We brought coffee from Perennial." The way he said it like a peace offering made me smile despite myself. We sat in the living room, where the autumn light fell thin across the rug. Rhea crossed her legs, smoothed her silk skirt, and placed a slim folder on the coffee table. "We wanted to talk about a few practical things," she began, tone sweet and managerial. "You've been handling everything alone since Julian passed, and we just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. That word always carries a shadow. Kenton added quickly. "You know how complicated finances can get. Rhea's been reading about elder scams, and we thought, well, better safe than sorry." I folded my hands in my lap. "That's thoughtful." Rhea leaned forward, sliding the folder closer. "It's just a simple power of attorney. It lets us help manage things if something happens, or if you just get tired of paperwork. You wouldn't believe how many families get caught off guard." The papers were crisp, printed on heavy stock, the kind used for contracts that mean something. I glanced at the signature line and saw my own name already typed beneath it, Meridian Hale Principal. "How did you find the form?" I asked lightly. "Oh." Kenton downloaded it from a legal site, she said. "Standard Massachusetts template." We filled in a few details, bank accounts, property titles, insurance policies, just so you wouldn't have to fuss. I let my eyes skim the text, pretending to read it for the first time, though every clause was familiar. I'd written reports that dissected documents just like this for clients who never realized they were signing away control. It all looked so official, I murmured. Exactly, Ria said, misreading my tone as admiration. And you know we'd never use it unless absolutely necessary. It's more of a backup plan. Kenton nodded. You can trust us, Mom. Trust was another word with a shadow. I picked up the pen she offered, uncapped it, and turned it slowly in my fingers. The motion steadied the faint tremor that had followed me all morning. I'll need to read this carefully, I said. Ria's smile tightened. Of course. We just thought we could sign it together today, make it official before the weekend. I appreciate the effort, I said, closing the folder with deliberate calm. But my attorney always told me never to sign anything on the same day it's presented. Ria blinked. You have an attorney? Not recently, I lied smoothly. Old advice that stuck. She laughed too quickly. Well, sure, that's fair. Just don't overthink it. It's standard language. Kenton shifted beside her, uncomfortable. We really do just want to help. I know, I said, looking from one to the other. And I'll call once I've read it through. Ria gathered her purse, her charm cracking slightly at the edges. Take your time, then. We only brought it because we care. When the door closed behind them, I stood for a long moment in the quiet. The sunflowers drooped in their paper wrap on the table, their bright heads heavy with morning dew. I carried the folder to my study and laid it beside the old folio from the night before. 2 stacks of paper, one meant to define me, one that reminded me who I'd been. I picked up my notebook and wrote a new line beneath yesterday's note, observe patterns. Document motive. The air felt heavier now, as though the stillness itself understood the opening move had been made. The next morning carried a gray stillness, the kind that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. I brewed coffee strong enough to sting and read through Ria's power of attorney again, every clause a thread pulling toward control. Their eagerness wasn't concern, it was positioning. By mid-morning, I'd made up my mind to visit the bank. It had been months since I'd gone in person. I mostly managed everything online now, quietly, methodically. Still, something about that folder made me want paper in my hands again, statements I could feel, not just see on a screen. The branch sat near Harvard Square, a red brick building that smelled faintly of old varnish and disinfectant. The front desk attendant recognized me with a polite smile. Good morning, Mrs. Hale. Would you like to see Mr. Kincaid? Yes, if he's in, I said. Tell him it's Meridian. Sorrel Kincaid had handled my accounts for over 20 years back when Julian and I first invested in municipal bonds, long before everything went digital. He was in his late 50s now, thin as a reed with hair going silver at the edges. When he saw me, he stood from behind his desk, adjusting his tie, like the act itself might buy him time. Meridian, he said warmly. It's been too long. He offered his hand and I shook it. I came to pick up physical copies of my statements. I'm reorganizing my records. Of course, he said, but there was a pause, small, deliberate. He turned toward his computer, typing something, then stopped. Before I print those, Ken, I ask if you authorized any recent online access changes. I felt the faintest chill. I don't believe so. He leaned back, lowered his voice. Last Friday, there was an attempt to add a secondary login to your primary checking account. It was flagged and denied by our system, but the request matched your home address. I folded my hands to keep them from shaking. Was there a name attached? He hesitated. It listed Kenton Hale as an additional user. The form was incomplete, which is why it was rejected. I was planning to call you this week, but since you're here, that won't be necessary, I said quietly. Thank you for catching it. Sorrel nodded, studying me as if measuring how much I already knew. Sometimes families mean well and just misunderstand permissions. Yes, I said. They misunderstand many things. He printed the statements and slid them across the desk in a neat envelope. I've seen a lot of accounts in my career, he said. You can tell who's careful, who's reckless, and who's ready to give up control. You've always been in the first category. I smiled faintly. You read numbers the way other people read faces. He chuckled, but his eyes stayed serious. Maybe, but you always did read numbers like people. You could tell their story before they did. The compliment felt like both recognition and reminder. I tucked the envelope into my bag, feeling its reassuring weight. As I stood to leave, he added, "If you ever want to add additional protections, we can freeze external access temporarily. Quietly. No notice to the other parties." "That might be wise," I said. "Let's do that." He made a few notes on the screen, nodding. "It's done. Only you can lift it." Outside, the November air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. I walked slowly toward the river, my heels clicking against wet pavement. The envelope pressed against my side like a heartbeat. Steady, deliberate, private. In that moment, the humiliation of Ria's dinner jokes felt almost quaint. This wasn't about laughter anymore. It was about access. Boundaries had been tested, and now they would be measured. When I reached the corner, I stopped at a crosswalk, the traffic light blinking red against my reflection in the glass window of a cafe. My face looked calm, but my pulse said otherwise. I'd spent years trying to forget how to be analytical, how to defend. Now those old instincts had returned uninvited, yet certain. I adjusted my scarf, turned back toward home, and began mentally cataloging every account, every password, every signature. Still mine. The snow had started early that morning, fine and soundless, the kind that softens a city until it feels like it's holding its breath. I was halfway through reorganizing the financial statements Sorrel had printed when a sharp knock came at the door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a man in a dark coat holding a clipboard. His breath clouded the air in front of him. When I opened the door, he gave a small, rehearsed smile. "Mrs. Meridian Hale." "Yes." He extended an envelope. "You've been served. Have a good day, ma'am." I took it, feeling the cold of his fingers still clinging to the paper. The door shut with a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet street. For a long moment, I just stood there, the envelope in my hand, snow melting on my shoes. Then I carried it to the kitchen and laid it flat on the counter beside the kettle. I knew what it was before I even tore the seal. Inside were 6 pages, stapled neatly, the heading, "Formal and Clinical Petition for Appointment of Conservator." The petitioner, Kenton Hale, joined by Ria March Hale. My vision narrowed to the text. Each line sounded less like law and more like betrayal, rendered in legalese. They were asking the court to declare me incapable of managing my affairs due to early cognitive decline and impaired financial judgment. The kettle began to hiss softly on the stove. Attached was Ria's affidavit. I forced myself to read it. Over the past year, it said, Meridian has exhibited confusion in conversations about her finances. She repeats information, forgets account details, and no longer recognizes market risk. We believe she is vulnerable to mismanagement and undue influence, no longer recognizes market risk. I almost laughed. The hiss grew into a shriek, but I didn't move to turn it off. I let the sound fill the room until it matched the pulse behind my eyes. They had done it crossed the line from manipulation to open warfare. I finally switched off the burner, the sudden silence loud enough to make my ears ring. Steam ghosted through the air, curling around the papers on the counter. I pressed my palm flat against the cool surface to steady myself. The signature block at the bottom bore my son's name written in a firm, confident hand I'd taught him myself when he was learning to sign school forms. Kenton. For a second, memory slipped through his 7-year-old self at the kitchen table, asking me to show him again how to make the loops even. Like this, I'd said, guiding his fingers over the paper. Neatness means care. Now that same hand had signed a petition declaring me unfit. I folded the document back into its envelope and carried it into the study. The snow outside had thickened, layering over the garden wall until everything looked untouched. But the stillness felt different now. No longer peace, but calculation. At my desk, I reached for my notebook. The ink bled slightly on the cold paper as I wrote. Petition for conservatorship filed by Kenton and Rhea Desi. 3. Grounds cognitive decline. Evidence fabricated. I wrote every word slowly, deliberately, until the sting behind my eyes settled into clarity. Betrayal has a way of sharpening the mind. I could feel mine settling into its old methodical rhythm. When I finished, I placed the notebook beside the folder marked M. Ellery Active Cases, and for the first time in years, I opened a new section. Subject: Hale v. Hale. Outside, the snow kept falling steady, endless, mercilessly clean. The first thing I did was clear the desk. Papers, pens, old envelopes all pushed aside until the wood surface showed its deep walnut grain again. The petition lay in the center, like a wound that needed stitching. I began to gather what I already had. Bank records. Sorrel printed. Rhea's power of attorney folder. Copies of old emails Kenton had sent about temporary transfers. I stacked them in chronological order. It steadied me, this rhythm of sorting. When logic returns, fear loses its grip. Each page held a small betrayal. There were transfers marked as short-term loans never repaid, purchases made with my joint account during Julian's final illness hotel, stays spa weekends payments to a design firm in New York. I'd let it go then, believing it was Rhea's way of coping. Now those same numbers whispered motive. I opened my laptop and pulled up the messages I'd archived over the years. Rhea had never imagined I'd keep them. Screenshots of her texts appeared one after another. Her tone as polished as her jewelry. You know. Kenton stressed. Could we borrow a little more just until his bonus hits? Or, you're so good with finances, Meridian. I don't know how you keep it all straight at your age. Every word carried a small insult, wrapped in politeness. I copied them into a folder labeled Hale Financial Correspondence, dated each file, and printed them one by one. The sound of the printer filled the house with a mechanical certainty that soothed me more than any apology could. When the stack was complete, I placed it beside the ledger where Julian and I had once tracked our joint accounts. He had always insisted on writing things by hand, his cursive looping neatly across the pages. I turned to the last entry he'd written, dated 3 months before he died. Under it, in his unmistakable handwriting, he had drawn an arrow and scribbled, "If they come for you, open drawer 3. My breath caught. I rose, walked to the tall cabinet against the wall, and knelt. The third drawer stuck, at first swollen with years of neglect, but I eased it open. Inside were neatly bound folders, a small box of fountain pens, and a single white envelope yellowed at the edges. Julian's handwriting again, Meridian only if necessary. Inside, I found 3 things. A letter folded twice a set of photocopied property deeds, and a business card so old the edges had curled slightly. The card read, Honor Livia Serrano, Massachusetts Superior Court. The name tugged at a memory that had been asleep for decades. Livia Serrano, then Livia Moreno, when we'd sat side by side in that old classroom at Boston University, debating ethics in financial law. She'd gone on to join the judiciary. I'd left to start a family. Julian must have kept in touch quietly. His letter confirmed it Mary, if the day ever comes when someone doubts you, call Livia. She remembers who you were before the world decided you were done. I ran my fingers over the ink. It had bled faintly from age, but his handwriting was steady, as if he'd written it, knowing I'd find it when strength would be harder to summon. I sat back on my heels, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen, again my unintentional timer for grief. I let it whistle until it quieted itself out. The house felt different now. Still, yes, but no longer empty. Purpose had weight, and it filled the air like gravity. I slipped the business card into my pocket, then opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote at the top, Objective disprove incompetence. Method, documentation, timeline, testimony. Resource Serrano Livia. The ink glistened under the lamplight before sinking into the paper. For years, I'd lived quietly content to be underestimated. But the ledger doesn't lie, and neither any longer would I. I waited until evening to make the call. The sky outside had gone the color of pewter, and the snow from yesterday had turned to slick gray slush along the curbs. The house was dim except for the amber pool of light over my desk. On the blotter lay Julian's letter and the old business card, its black ink still sharp, despite the years. The number hadn't changed. I dialed it slowly, pressing each button as if it carried weight. It rang 3 times before a clipped voice answered. Judge Serrano's chambers. "This is Meridian Hale," I said, steady but formal. "I'd like to speak with Judge Serrano. It's a personal matter." There was a pause, paper rustling the faint clack of a keyboard. Then the voice returned, lower now. "Did you say Meridian Hale?" "Yes. Tell her it's Ellery." A silence stretched thin as wire. "Then please hold." The line clicked, replaced by a faint hum, and then another voice came through, older, deeper, and touched with recognition. "Meridian, or do I still call you Ellery?" I exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. "Either works." "I wasn't sure you'd remember." "Remember," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I've quoted you to my clerks for years. The numbers never lie. People just decorate them." "You were the calmest forensic witness I ever saw." I closed my eyes for a moment, the memory unspooling easily. A younger version of me standing in a courtroom under fluorescent lights, hands steady on a stack of ledgers. A defense attorney pacing, sweating, and finally muttering to his client that cross-examination was useless. The calm scalpel the Boston Globe had called me afterward. I'd hated the nickname then, but now it sounded like a life I'd misplaced. "I left all that behind a long time ago," I said. "Julian mentioned that once," Livia said. "He was proud of how you rebuilt a quiet life. He sent me a Christmas card the year Kenton graduated." The warmth in her tone faltered when I didn't answer, so she continued gently. "I assume this isn't a social call." "No. My son and daughter-in-law have filed a petition for conservatorship. They're claiming cognitive decline." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Meridian, that's serious. Do you have counsel?" "Not yet. But I have documentation, ledgers, messages, evidence of motive, enough to make their case collapse if handled correctly." "Typical of you," she said, "building truth before emotion. I was trained that way." Another pause. "I can't preside, you understand," she said quietly. "Conflict of interest given our history. But I can tell you this much. Judge Moore has the case. Fair but cautious. She'll expect precision, not outrage. I can manage precision." "I have no doubt," she replied. "But Meridian, don't underestimate the optics. You've been out of the professional sphere for decades. They'll frame this as age, not intellect. You'll need representation." "Do you have anyone you'd recommend?" Livia hesitated, then said, "There's a mid-career attorney I respect, Atticus Vale, former auditor, smart with evidence. I'll ask him to expect your call quietly." The sound of her pen tapping came faintly through the receiver. "And, Meridian, this will get personal. They'll drag memory, emotion, even grief into it. Keep your composure. The courtroom feeds on tone more than truth." I smiled faintly. "I remember. Never raise your voice, just raise the evidence." Livia chuckled. "God, you haven't changed." Then softer, "I'm glad you called. Julian was right. You were never done. You just stepped aside." The line clicked as she ended the call, leaving me in the low hum of the house. I sat there, phone still in hand, watching snowlight ripple against the window pane. Somewhere between fear and determination, a part of me that had gone dormant began to stir the part that once dismantled lies for a living. On the desk, Julian's letter caught the lamplight. His words had become instruction, not comfort. If they come for you, open drawer 3. I had opened it. And now finally, I was ready to use what waited inside. Atticus Vale arrived on a Wednesday morning when the light outside was thin and blue. He was younger than I expected, perhaps mid-40s, with careful hands and a deliberate way of speaking. The kind of man who listened more than he talked, rare in law, rarer in men. He removed his coat, glancing around my study. "You have quite the library, Mrs. Hale. Numbers and words," I said. "Both tell stories when you know where to look." He smiled, setting his briefcase on the table. "Judge Serrano told me you were unusually thorough." She was being polite, I said. "I'm obsessive." That broke the formality between us. We worked through coffee papers spread across the desk. He read quietly while I explained the patterns, how Ria's withdrawals had followed Kenton's bonuses, how every loan aligned with large purchases in their names. He listened without interruption, only underlining figures in soft pencil. "Did you compile all this yourself?" he asked after a while. "Yes." "Then you hardly need a lawyer." "I need a face," I corrected. "Someone the court recognizes as a professional buffer. My presence will invite biased older woman accused of decline. Yours will keep them guessing." He leaned back, studying me. "And what will you be doing while I play the face?" "The real work," I said simply. "Preparing their mistake." He nodded once. "All right. Tell me your plan." I outlined it step by step. Gather more written proof of Ria's influence over Kenton, document every contact, avoid confrontation. Then when the hearing came, allow them to present exaggerated claims until they discredited themselves. "People who fabricate," I said, "always overreach. The trick is to stay still until they do." Atticus's expression softened, half admiration, half concern. "That's a dangerous amount of patience." "It's the only kind I have left," I said. He spent the next hour reviewing the petition, making margin notes. Occasionally, he looked up with quiet surprise, as though realizing the person across from him wasn't his usual client. "You've built an evidentiary trail that's airtight," he said finally. "Every inconsistency will fold under questioning." "I know. You're not nervous." "I'm practiced," I said, tapping the ledger. "I spent 15 years dissecting lies. This isn't new, just personal." He gathered the papers into his case. "Then we'll proceed as agreed. I'll file the formal appearance with the court, nothing more. You'll stay behind the scenes." "Exactly. Let them think I'm retreating." Atticus paused at the door, then looked back. "You're aware Ria's attorney will underestimate you, right?" "That's the goal." He gave a small laugh, shaking his head. "I can see why Serrano spoke of you the way she did. You're methodical." "Age doesn't dull method," I said. "It refines it." When he left, the house fell silent again, but not with the loneliness of before. It was a strategic silence, now full of calculation. I walked back to the desk, straightened the stacks of evidence, and opened my notebook. Under the last line, I wrote, "Step 4, control the narrative. Step 5, wait." Outside, a light snow began to fall thin as powdered glass against the window pane. The city below moved on, unaware that a quiet war had already begun inside a small house near the river. One fought not with rage, but with precision and memory sharpened by love betrayed. The message arrived just after dusk, when the first streetlights blinked on along Brattle Street, and the city's hum softened into evening. My phone buzzed, once a quiet pulse, against the kitchen table. It was from my niece, Mara. "Aunt Mary, you need to see this. I didn't want to, but it's everywhere in the family chat." She attached a series of screenshots, blue and gray, bubbles, small digital daggers dressed as humor. Ria's name appeared again and again. "Kenton's mom still thinks she's the family accountant. We're trying to help before she donates the house to a cat shelter." Then a string of laughing emojis, followed by early onset of something for sure. "Poor woman can't even manage Netflix." My throat went dry. I read them once, then again slower, as if repetition could dull their edge. The other names in the thread hurt more than the words themselves: nieces, cousins, people who'd eaten at my table who now clicked tiny hearts beneath Ria's jokes. I scrolled until I reached the last line. The hearing's next month. Once it's done, maybe we can finally get her to rest. Rest. The word landed like a verdict. I set the phone down and looked around the kitchen. The light from the lamp turned everything golden. The stack of invoices, the framed photo of Julian, the small plant Ria had given me last Mother's Day, with a tag that read, "For calm days ahead." It was dying now, leaves brittle at the edges. I opened the drawer, took out my notebook, and wrote the date and time. Then I returned to the phone, enlarging each screenshot, saving them carefully to a new folder. Pain has its own methodical rhythm. The printer on the desk began to hum as I sent the files through. One by one, the pages slid out warm and smelling faintly of toner. I arranged them in sequence, stapled the corners, and added them to the growing binder of evidence. There was a strange peace in the process. The betrayal hurt, yes, but the act of documenting it gave me back a kind of control, small, steady, measurable. I'd learned long ago that people reveal themselves most fully when they think they're being funny. When the last page was filed, I brewed tea and sat by the window. Outside, snow flurries drifted under the lamplight, like dust shaken from an old world. Somewhere beyond the quiet, I could almost hear Ria laughing again, her voice smooth and rehearsed. I let the sound exist in memory only long enough to decide where it belonged in the record, not in me. By the time the kettle cooled, I'd labeled the folder Exhibit C, Social Commentary. Then I closed the binder and set it neatly beside the ledger, its weight a comfort against the uncertainty gathering at the edge of my thoughts. The laughter would fade. The record would remain. Ria called that morning with a voice like honey poured over steel. "We're dropping by in an hour," she said. Kenton thought it would be nice to talk things through before everything gets too official. Before. The word hung in the air long after she ended the call. I placed the receiver down, then looked across the quiet room to the old radio on the counter. Its dial cracked its speaker, long dead. Inside, nestled beneath the metal casing, sat a small digital recorder I'd bought years ago for note-taking. It worked perfectly fine despite its age. Massachusetts was a one-party consent state. I had checked twice. By the time the knock came, the red light on the recorder glowed steady. Ria entered first, as always, followed by Kenton carrying a box of croissants. She smiled, as if we'd never stood on opposite sides of a courtroom filing. We brought breakfast, a peace offering. "That's kind," I said. "The kettle's already on." We sat at the kitchen table. The snow outside had melted to sleet, tapping against the windows in a rhythm that made the silence between us sound heavier. Ria poured coffee, filling each mug to the brim, her manicured fingers steady. So she began, "We just want to make sure you're not feeling overwhelmed. This whole process can sound worse than it is. It's really just a precaution." Kenton avoided my eyes. "We didn't want you to think we're against you, Mom." I appreciate that, I said, watching the steam rise from my cup. Ria leaned forward slightly. "The hearing will go smoother if we all say the same thing. Consistency matters. So when the evaluator asks, just be honest about the little things, forgetting bills or names or numbers," I said. She blinked, recovering fast. "Well, only if it comes up naturally." Kenton's voice was quieter. "Ria, maybe we should—" She touched his arm. "It's fine, darling. She deserves to know we're trying to help. The judge will want examples, that's all. Just stick to the story about how she's been distracted lately." My heart thudded once hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I forced my breathing, even kept my expression neutral. "Distracted," I repeated softly. "That's the word you're using." "Don't make it sound so harsh," she said. "You're still yourself, just not quite as sharp. There's nothing shameful about that." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the ticking of the kitchen clock growing louder. I focused on the sound, the steady, measurable truth of seconds passing. The recorder's light blinked once, invisible from their side of the counter. Ria went on. Kenton will mention the time you mixed up the account passwords, and maybe the day you got lost driving to our place. That's enough to establish a pattern. The court likes patterns. Her choice of words nearly made me laugh. Kenton shifted, uncomfortable. Ria, maybe we shouldn't— Oh, stop worrying, she interrupted. It's not like she'll deny it. She knows it's true. I sipped my coffee. And if I do— Ria smiled that polished smile again, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Then we'll all just look confused. The judge will understand. A silence stretched between us, long and fragile. I could hear my pulse in my ears, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint scrape of Ria's ring against her mug. Everything ordinary except that it wasn't. I stood and took their empty cups to the sink. You've both been very clear, I said, rinsing them under the tap. It's good to know where we stand. Ria rose, smoothing her coat. We only want what's best. I'm sure you do. They left with polite goodbyes, their footsteps fading down the front steps, the car door slamming, the engine starting. The house fell silent again. I walked back to the counter and stopped the recording. The small red light winked out. My hands trembled slightly as I removed the memory card and placed it inside a small glass jar on the shelf above the stove. Outside, the sleet had turned to rain, streaking the windows in thin silver lines. I stood there until the sound blended with my own breath, steady again, steady enough to continue. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Every sound, heels on tile, the low murmur of voices, seemed amplified in the long marble corridor. I arrived 15 minutes early, the way I used to, when I testified years ago, before my name had been replaced by Mom, and later by the problem. Ria and Kenton were already there, surrounded by two of her cousins, and a man in a gray suit who looked every inch the opportunist she believed was an ally. Ria laughed at something he said, that bright, practiced laugh that carried too far in the quiet hall. I stood at the end of the corridor, unnoticed for a moment. The light from the high windows fell across the floor, turning the tiles into alternating bands of shadow and shine. I watched them, Kenton's stiff shoulders, Ria's easy poise, and felt a strange calm, the same stillness that used to come over me before cross-examination. When Ria saw me, her expression flickered into surprise before settling into pity. She leaned toward her cousin and said something low, but not low enough. She looks so lost. I hope she remembered why she's here. Her cousin chuckled softly. Kenton didn't react. He was staring at the wall. His jaw set the profile of a boy who'd been told this was for the best. I walked toward them, each step steady, each breath measured. The old leather handbag hung at my side, and the folio pressed against my ribs like armor. I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to Julian's memorial, the one Ria had once called respectable in a grandmotherly way. It would do. Good morning, I said. Ria turned, smile poised. Meridian, you made it. I received the summons. It seemed important. Her lawyer, Mr. Holcomb, I gathered, stepped forward. Mrs. Hale, good to meet you. I'm representing your son and daughter-in-law today. His handshake was light, perfunctory. I met his eyes. Of course you are. We all stood there in a brief, uneasy silence. Somewhere down the hall, a bailiff's voice called another case. Ria adjusted her scarf, pretending confidence, and Kenton finally spoke. Mom, we didn't want this to feel adversarial, he said. It's just about making sure you're cared for. I'm touched, I replied. You've both been so thorough. Ria blinked, uncertain whether to take it as gratitude or rebuke. I didn't help her decide. The clerk appeared then, a young woman with kind eyes and a stack of files in her arms. Hamilton versus Hale, room 4B, she called. We followed her down the corridor. Ria's laughter resumed softer now, but it echoed all the same. "I hope she remembers where to sit," she murmured to one cousin. I kept my pace slow and deliberate, the folio secure beneath my arm. Inside were copies of ledgers, emails, and that single audio file labeled Kitchen Conversation MP3. The recorder itself remained at home, tucked safely in a locked drawer. But I could still hear the echo of Ria's voice in my memory. "Just stick to the story about how she forgets numbers." As we reached the courtroom door, Atticus Vale appeared from a side corridor, briefcase in hand. His nod was professional, nothing more. But his eyes met mine with quiet understanding. He would speak when I needed him to, and no more. The clerk opened the door. "You may enter." Ria brushed past me, first perfume trailing behind her, sweet, expensive, and sharp. Kenton followed, not meeting my gaze. I stepped in last, letting the door close with a soft click behind me. The room was smaller than I remembered from my old days on the stand. Same pale walls, same flags, same solemn air. I took my seat at the defendant's table, folding my hands carefully on the surface, the tremor in my right hand barely visible now. Across the aisle, Ria whispered something to Kenton, and he nodded without looking up. The bailiff called for quiet. For the briefest second, before the judge entered, I looked at them both, my son and the woman he'd chosen, and thought, let them see what they built. Then the door behind the bench opened, and the sound of footsteps marked the beginning of everything that would follow. The judge entered with the same calm authority that could still a room. Her nameplate read Honor Meredith Moore, the kind of woman who had seen every flavor of family dispute and learned not to blink at any of them. We rose as she took her seat, and when she said, "Be seated," her voice was quiet, but absolute. Holcomb stood first. His suit was immaculate, his tone rehearsed. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of ensuring the well-being of an elderly parent who can no longer manage her financial responsibilities. My clients, Kenton Hale and Rhea March Hale, have filed this petition out of concern, not conflict." He smiled toward the bench, a politician's smile, then gestured vaguely toward me. "Mrs. Hale is by all accounts a kind and once capable woman, but recent behavior demonstrates a pattern of decline, misplaced funds, erratic decisions, memory lapses. My clients only seek to protect what remains of the estate from mismanagement." Rhea looked appropriately grave beside him. Kenton stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Judge Moore turned to me. "Mrs. Hale, do you have counsel present?" Atticus Vale rose. "Atticus Vale, representing Mrs. Hale, Your Honor. And will Mrs. Hale be making her own statements?" Atticus glanced my way. "She will, Your Honor, if permitted." Holcomb gave a faint laugh. "With respect, I'm not sure the defendant fully understands these proceedings." I met his gaze evenly. "You may be surprised, Mr. Holcomb." He hesitated, uncertain whether to take offense or pity. "Your Honor, we'd like to begin by establishing Mrs. Hale's inability to comprehend complex financial matters. With your permission, I'll ask a few questions." "Proceed," Judge Moore said. Holcomb approached, his voice gentle but patronizing. "Mrs. Hale, can you tell the court the approximate value of your husband's estate at the time of his passing?" $62 million, I said. He raised an eyebrow. "That's very precise. I handled the account summaries myself." He smirked. "Of course you did. And could you explain the concept of market risk in layman's terms?" I folded my hands on the table. "It's the potential for an investment's actual return to differ from its expected return due to changes in market variables, interest rates, currency fluctuations, corporate performance. But I imagine you already know that." A ripple of amusement ran through the gallery. Holcomb's smile faltered. Judge Moore looked up from her notes, curious now. "Mr. Holcomb, continue." Holcomb flipped through his file too quickly. Yes, well, terminology aside, it's our position that Mrs. Hale has demonstrated an increasing inability to manage her own accounts. We have documentation of repeated assistance requested from her son. I leaned slightly toward my attorney and whispered, "May I respond?" Atticus nodded once. "Your Honor," I said, rising slowly, the tremor in my right hand barely visible now. Mr. Holcomb is correct about one thing I've asked for help. Once to install a new streaming service, once to lift a box of files from my attic. But my financial management remains my own, Holcomb interrupted. Your Honor, this kind of defensive speech only reinforces our concern. She's clearly struggling to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant details. Judge Moore held up a hand. Mr. Holcomb let her finish. I reached into my handbag and withdrew a small, worn leather wallet. Inside was a laminated card edges frayed from decades of use. I placed it on the table and slid it toward the clerk. Your Honor, I said this is my Massachusetts Bar Association identification, license number 041827, active since 1982. The room shifted. The clerk handed it to the judge, who studied it closely. Her brows lifted slightly. Holcomb blinked. Excuse me, my bar card, I said simply. You see, before I became Mrs. Hale, I was Mr. Ellery, forensic accountant and expert witness for the Commonwealth in several major fraud cases. I haven't practiced in years, but my credentials remain active. Holcomb's mouth opened, then closed again. Meridian Hale, as in Ellery. The silence that followed was dense enough to hear the ticking of the clock above the bench. Even Ria's composure cracked her whisper, cutting through the stillness. That can't be right. Judge Moore set the card down gently. It appears it is, she said. Mr. Holcomb, proceed carefully from here. The court now recognizes Mrs. Hale's legal background. I sat again, folding my hands in my lap, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. Across the aisle, Ria stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Kenton looked pale, his pen frozen above his notes. I glanced toward Atticus, who gave the slightest nod, acknowledgement, not triumph. The balance in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. For years, they'd mistaken silence for weakness. But silence, I realized, had only been preparation. Judge Moore adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Hale, she said evenly, since your credentials have been verified, I'll allow you limited self-representation under counsel supervision. Proceed carefully. Thank you, Your Honor. The room had shifted. What had begun as an inquiry into my supposed frailty now felt like an examination of something else entirely. Ria's smirk had vanished. Even Holcomb seemed smaller, his confidence thinned by the weight of what he didn't know how to anticipate. I rose and placed a binder on the evidence table. Its spine was labeled neatly in my handwriting. Hale Financial History, 2014 to present. This I began as a complete record of financial transfers between myself and the petitioners over the last 10 years. Each withdrawal, each repayment promise, each email thread. I opened the binder slowly, allowing the pages to catch the courtroom light. Every number verified, every date cross-checked. I've color-coded inconsistencies for the court's convenience. Judge Moore leaned forward. Mr. Vale, she said to Atticus, has this material been reviewed? Atticus nodded. It has. Your Honor, all original documentation authenticated through the bank. Holcomb attempted a polite laugh. Mrs. Hale, with respect, this isn't an audit. We're here to assess mental capacity, not bookkeeping. On the contrary, I said calmly, competence by legal definition is the ability to understand and manage one's financial affairs. I'm presenting precisely that. I turned a page, my voice steady. According to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 190B, Section 5401 conservatorship requires clear and convincing evidence that the individual cannot effectively manage property or business affairs. So far, all we've heard is conjecture. There was a pause, the kind that changes temperature in a room. Rhea shifted beside Kenton, whispering urgently, but her voice carried farther than she realized. "She's bluffing. Just keep your mouth shut." I looked at her evenly. "I'm afraid I don't bluff." From my bag, I took a small USB drive and held it up. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to submit an additional piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between the petitioners captured in my home kitchen on December 10th. For reference, Massachusetts is a one-party consent state." Holcomb's face drained of color. "Your Honor, we object." "On what grounds?" Judge Moore asked. "On grounds of relevance." "Overruled," the judge said, her tone clipped. "Proceed." Atticus connected the drive to the courtroom speaker system. The room filled with a faint hum, then the sound of my own kettle in the background. Rhea's voice emerged smooth and confident. "The hearing will go smoother if we all say the same thing. Just stick to the story about how she forgets numbers." There was a collective intake of breath. Then Kenton's quieter tone. "Rhea, maybe this isn't—" "It's fine," she cut in. "Once she's declared incompetent, the assets are ours. It's not like she'll even understand what's happening." The playback ended. The silence that followed was complete, heavy, unblinking, alive. Kenton's pen slipped from his fingers, hitting the table with a soft, hollow sound. He didn't move to pick it up. Rhea stared straight ahead, her face frozen in a mask of disbelief, as if silence could still negotiate mercy. Judge Moore exhaled slowly. "Mr. Holcomb." He cleared his throat, but no words came. "Noted," the judge said quietly. She turned to me. "Mrs. Hale, thank you. The court will recess for 15 minutes before further questioning." As the bailiff announced the break, I gathered my papers with deliberate care. Each motion was precise, unhurried, the discipline of someone who'd spent a lifetime letting evidence speak louder than emotion. When I looked up, Kenton was watching me, his face a mixture of shame and something softer, harder to name. I gave him the smallest nod, acknowledgement, not forgiveness. Outside the windows, snow began to fall again, steady and white, erasing the outlines of everything it touched. Inside, the only sound left was the faint rhythmic flutter of pages, turning receipts, records, the quiet proof of a mother's mind intact. When the court reconvened, the air felt thinner, as if the very oxygen had been filtered through judgment. Everyone was quieter. No more whispered strategy between Rhea and Holcomb. No nervous laughter from her cousins in the gallery. The only sound was the shuffle of papers and the slow, deliberate rhythm of Judge Moore's pen as she wrote her ruling. I sat perfectly still, hands folded over my folio. Atticus leaned slightly toward me, murmuring, "Whatever happens now, you've already won more than they'll admit." I gave no reply. There was no victory in this kind of war, only survival, measured in steady breathing. Judge Moore cleared her throat. "The court has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in Hale v. Hale. We find the petition for conservatorship unsupported by credible proof." Her voice, though calm, carried a weight that pressed against the marble walls. The respondent's claim of cognitive decline lacks medical or factual basis. In contrast, Mrs. Hale has demonstrated not only competence but exceptional understanding of her financial affairs. A faint murmur spread through the gallery. The judge continued, tone sharpening. "The court further finds evidence of coordinated misrepresentation and undue influence by the petitioners Kenton and Rhea March Hale. Their actions constitute harassment and may meet preliminary thresholds for fraud under Massachusetts law." Rhea inhaled sharply. "Your Honor, that's not Mrs. March Hale," the judge interrupted, her tone slicing through the air. "I suggest silence, unless you wish to add contempt to your record." Rhea's words died before they formed. Kenton sat motionless beside her, eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Moore closed the folder in front of her. Accordingly, this court denies the petition in its entirety. All control of assets remains with Mrs. Meridian Hale. The petitioners are hereby admonished for misuse of judicial process. She looked at me then, directly, steadily. Mrs. Hale, your composure throughout these proceedings is commendable. Not all truths require shouting. Some are proven by endurance. I nodded, but I didn't smile. I only let out the breath I'd been holding since the first day I'd opened that envelope. It felt heavier than air, an exhalation built from months of restraint. Judge Moore gathered her notes. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. When I stood, the sound of benches scraping echoed through the room. Atticus touched my elbow briefly, a quiet gesture of solidarity. Across the aisle, Holcomb was already packing his briefcase, face pale and set. Rhea rose slowly, her poise fractured now, every movement too deliberate. She turned to Kenton, whispering something I couldn't hear. He didn't answer. I left the courtroom before they did. The corridor outside was lined with waiting faces, journalists, interns, observers. Someone whispered, "That's her!" And then another voice, the one who caught her own family. Camera flashes blinked softly. Hesitant at first, as though uncertain whether to intrude. I kept walking past the murmurs, past the marble pillars, until the heavy courthouse doors opened to a rush of winter air. Outside, snow was falling again, but slower now. Large, soft flakes that melted the instant they touched the ground. The noise from the crowd faded behind me. For a moment, I simply stood beneath the gray sky, feeling neither triumphant nor broken, just emptied. Atticus joined me a few steps later. "You could sue them," he said quietly. "I could," I replied, "but I won't. Some lessons need to cost exactly what they took." He nodded, understanding more than most would. Across the street, the river shimmered under thin ice. The city moved around it as if nothing monumental had just ended. I tightened my coat, clutching the worn leather strap of my handbag, the same one that had carried every piece of proof, every fragment of the story no one believed until now. I began to walk toward the square, each step slow and deliberate. The snow gathered lightly on my shoulders, disappearing as it landed like something finally forgiven by time. The cottage in Gloucester was barely 900 square feet, built in the 1940s. Its walls weathered the color of sea mist. The realtor had called it charming but modest, which after the last few months sounded perfect. The ocean was 20 steps away. When the tide rolled in, I could hear it breathing through the rocks, like an old friend relearning speech. Moving here was quiet, almost ceremonial. I brought only what mattered. Julian's letters, my notebook, a single framed photo of the two of us taken before the gray, streaked my hair. The rest I left behind in Cambridge, boxed and anonymous, for a charity pickup that never asked for explanations. The mornings came slower here. I would wake to the gulls make coffee in a chipped blue mug and watch the water turn from pewter to silver. No headlines, no court filings, no calls from reporters asking how it felt to win. The word never sat right. You don't win against your own blood. You just stop losing yourself to them. The day after the verdict, Livia called. "I knew you'd vanish somewhere near Saltwater," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority it had in law school. "But I didn't think you'd vanish completely." "I haven't," I said. "I'm here. I just changed direction." "You always did prefer the scenic route," she teased. Then after a pause, her tone softened. "There's something you could help me with if you're ready to work again." It turned out she'd been quietly building an initiative through the Superior Court's community branch, an elder justice clinic offering free legal counsel to older adults targeted by family or financial abuse. "We've got funding for staff," she explained, "but what we don't have is the structure, the system. That," I said, "I can design." For weeks, I spent my mornings at the cottage desk drafting intake forms, training outlines, and confidentiality protocols. The afternoons belonged to Livia's small office in Salem, where we met with volunteers, law students, paralegals, retired accountants. They listened more than they spoke, which was a good sign. The clinic's first clients were a retired librarian whose son had forged her digital signature and a widower tricked into selling his home equity. Their stories mirrored mine in small, shattering ways. I learned to channel my own pain into precision, documenting evidence, refining templates, teaching others the difference between panic and proof. When the non-profit papers were finalized, Livia insisted we share credit. "It was your fire," she said. "No," I corrected gently. "It was my aftermath. You lit the match." The brass plate came a month later. I'd commissioned it from a craftsman in Rockport, a man named Ellis, who worked out of a narrow shed by the harbor. He was quiet and slow-moving, like someone who'd long ago learned not to rush art. When he asked what I wanted engraved, I handed him a folded slip of paper. 2 days later, he delivered the finished piece by invitation. He tilted his head, curious. "That a business name or a warning?" Neither, I said. "It's a truth." I mounted it beside the front door myself. The metal caught the afternoon light and glowed softly, as if alive. It wasn't about exclusion. It was about peace earned, not assumed. That evening, when I returned from the clinic, a small envelope waited in the mail slot. The handwriting was Kenton's tight, cautious. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. "We're sorry." No signature, no explanation. Just those 2 words. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it light as paper, heavy as history. Then I placed it unopened in the drawer beside Julian's last letter. Some truths didn't need answers, only boundaries. Outside, the sea murmured against the rocks, patient and endless. I stood at the window, watching the light fade from gray to blue to black. The plate by the door glinted once in the twilight, as if winking in quiet agreement. In this place, peace wasn't loud. It didn't need to forgive to exist. It simply stayed by invitation only. Spring returned to Massachusetts with a fragile kind of brightness, the kind that almost apologized for winter. The Elder Justice Clinic had grown faster than any of us expected. Every week, new volunteers came in with fresh faces, notebooks ready, and the same cautious hope I used to wear years ago. Livia ran the sessions with her characteristic precision, while I remained in the background, reviewing reports, refining case flow, building structure. The work was quieter now, but it had weight. In late May, the clinic hosted its first fundraising gala at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The invitation, embossed in navy and silver, had arrived with my name printed below the words, "Honorary Founding Benefactor, Meridian Hale." I hadn't planned to attend, but Livia was persuasive as always. "It's not about celebration," she told me. "It's about witness. Let people see what survival looks like when it learns to give back." So I went. The museum's atrium glowed under chandeliers and murmurs. Waiters moved through the crowd like quiet punctuation marks carrying trays of champagne. Livia stood near the podium, elegant as ever, greeting judges, journalists, and law students who spoke to her with equal reverence. I stood beside one of the marble columns, letting the evening move around me. I'd traded courtroom navy for charcoal silk, a simple dress that didn't demand attention. Across the room, my brass nameplate gleamed on the donor wall, newly installed that morning. Halfway through the evening, I saw her. Rhea stood near the back, her posture too straight, her smile too careful. The sharpness she'd once worn like armor was gone. She looked smaller, though not physically. Something in her had diminished. A friend must have invited her. The gala was open to supporters of elder rights organizations, and I suspected guilt occasionally masquerades as generosity. She caught sight of me before I could look away. For a moment, we simply regarded each other across the expanse of murmuring guests and polished glass. The orchestra's strings softened into a waltz, and the sound seemed to slow time itself. She hesitated, wine glass in hand, as if weighing a lifetime of words against the few she might still offer. Then slowly she shook her head just once and looked down. It wasn't defiance. It was recognition, the kind that doesn't need language. I turned toward the exhibit hall, letting the crowd swallow the moment. Inside, the air was cooler, the lights lower. Paintings lined the walls, portraits, seascapes, still lifes, each a different version of human quiet. One canvas caught my eye, an oil of Gloucester Harbor at dawn, the water silver and still boats barely rippling their reflections. It looked almost like my cottage window. Livia found me there. You slipped away before the speeches, she said softly. I've said enough words for one life, I replied. She smiled. Then at least hear this. The clinic received enough pledges tonight to stay open for 5 years. You built something permanent. I just balanced an equation, I said. One debt paid forward. Later, after the applause and goodbyes, I returned to Gloucester. The drive took an hour, empty roads, radio low, the kind of solitude that no longer felt like absence. The sea greeted me with its familiar hush. Inside the cottage smelled faintly of salt and ink. I poured tea, sat at my desk, and opened my journal to a fresh page. The ink flowed easily under my hand as I wrote, Silence isn't surrender, it's remembering who built the walls. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the window like an old friend knocking just to be sure I was still there. On the shelf above the brass plate caught the lamplight. By invitation, its edges warm with age. I closed the journal, set down the pen, and let the sound of the tide fill the room. Somewhere beyond the waves, Boston glittered full of motion and voices, but I no longer needed to be heard there. The balance finally was complete, measured not in victory, but in peace earned and boundaries kept. The night deepened. I sat still listening as the ocean turned its endless pages beyond my window, each wave erasing the last.